On the morning of August 15, 1940, Oberleutnant Hans-Karl Steinkeller of Luftwaffe Kampfgeschwader 1 descended through heavy cloud cover over Kent toward his target, RAF Biggin Hill, one of Britain's most critical fighter bases. Steinkeller had memorized the intelligence briefing precisely. Biggin Hill sat 21 miles south-southeast of London, identifiable by its distinctive satellite landing fields and distinctive A-shaped hangars. The Luftwaffe had attacked it 4 times already that summer, and each time the photographs showed the airfield exactly where it should be. But on this particular morning, as Steinkeller's Heinkel He-111 bomber levelled out at 8,000 feet and his bombardier lined up the targeting scope, something was profoundly wrong. The airfield had vanished, not destroyed, not cratered and cratered into ruins, but genuinely, completely vanished. Steinkeller's crew would not be alone in experiencing this disorienting sensation. By the end of 1940, approximately 600 German bomber sorties had been directed at what appeared to be RAF Biggin Hill, yet fewer than 30 bombs would land on the actual active airfield. The Luftwaffe had conducted countless bombing runs, dropped thousands of bombs, lost aircraft to anti-aircraft fire, defending against phantom targets, and achieved almost nothing. The problem was not German accuracy or determination. The problem was that the British had made a 364-acre operational airfield completely invisible to aerial reconnaissance, not through camouflage or concealment in the traditional sense, but through something far more radical. They had built an entirely fake airfield, complete with operational appearing buildings, dummy aircraft, fuel storage, and aircraft hangars, positioned less than 2 miles away from the real one. From the air, from photographs, from every reconnaissance method available to the Luftwaffe's intelligence service, the fake airfield looked like the real thing, and considerably more obvious than the real thing. This wasn't a minor deception. It was an inversion of everything military theory understood about protecting critical installations. The conventional wisdom insisted that you hid your airfield, dispersed its aircraft, camouflaged its structures, and made it blend into the landscape. Instead, the British had done something that appeared suicidal. They had made a fake airfield so convincingly obvious that it became the target. What seemed like a catastrophic vulnerability, an airfield so prominent that it could be found in seconds by every bomber pilot in Germany, turned out to be the most effective air defence measure in the entire RAF arsenal. The apparent weakness was actually the genius. On paper, RAF Biggin Hill shouldn't have been survivable after 1940 began. Military doctrine across every air force agreed on this principle. An airfield was a static installation with immense strategic value. It could not be moved. It could not be hidden. The best you could do was make it small, dispersed, difficult to locate, and difficult to hit once located. The Germans had studied the Spanish Civil War obsessively and concluded that concentrated air attacks on fixed targets produced devastating results. When Luftwaffe flyers had bombed Spanish Republican airfields at Getafe and Barayas in 1937, they had succeeded in destroying aircraft on the ground because the airfields were consolidated, identifiable, and stationary. The logical conclusion: to defend an airfield, you distributed its aircraft to hidden dispersal points, you broke up its hangars into camouflage shelters, you moved fuel storage underground, and you made the installation as difficult to locate and identify as possible. The German bombing intelligence network had been perfected over years of pre-war work. Nazi intelligence officers had visited RAF stations in the 1930s before war was declared. They had photographed installations officially. They had recruited agents. They had maintained detailed files with grid coordinates, building layouts, aircraft capacity numbers, and operational procedures for nearly every significant RAF base in southern England. Biggin Hill's file was particularly complete, marked with red priority designations and distributed to bomber wings with explicit targeting instructions. Standard military thinking emphasized that air superiority could be achieved through offensive bombing operations that destroyed enemy aircraft on the ground. critics of the RAF's defensive strategy argued that dispersal and camouflage were temporary measures, that air attack would find and destroy concentrated aircraft eventually, and that only overwhelming numerical superiority or complete air superiority could protect an airfield. The Luftwaffe's strength lay precisely in the ability to deliver that overwhelming numerical superiority. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe could assemble 600 to 800 bombers for major operations against England. The RAF, by contrast, operated roughly 200 operational fighter aircraft across all of southern England. Simple mathematics suggested that concentrated bombing attacks against RAF airfields would rapidly deplete British aircraft numbers to the point where air superiority would become impossible to maintain. On paper, this shouldn't have worked. The British couldn't possibly defend themselves against such odds. The math was elementary and brutal, yet there was a deeper reality hidden within this mathematical certainty. A reality that emerged from understanding exactly how aerial reconnaissance actually worked, and exactly what made an airfield militarily valuable. The problem began with a fundamental contradiction in Luftwaffe doctrine. Precision bombing required both location accuracy and target identification. A bomber pilot operating at 15,000 feet in cloud conditions could not bomb what they could not see. Reconnaissance photographs provided precise grid coordinates, but grid coordinates meant nothing if the target had moved, been dispersed, or if nearby terrain had changed. Consider the technical reality of the situation. An RAF airfield required specific infrastructure to function. It needed hangars to house aircraft, fuel storage to keep them flying, maintenance facilities to keep them operational, and visible dispersal points where aircraft could be parked. It needed a recognizable layout when viewed from above. Most critically, it needed to look like an active military installation. An airfield that wasn't obviously an airfield would be useless, because the pilots using it would need to navigate to it, land on it, and refuel from it. The contradiction was absolute. You couldn't make an airfield invisible to your own pilots while making it invisible to enemy bombers. The secret was in understanding what actually mattered in aerial reconnaissance versus what merely looked convincing in photographs. German reconnaissance aircraft, primarily Dornier Du-17Ps and Messerschmitt Bf 110Cs stripped of weapons to maximize altitude and speed, took photographs at various altitudes. These photographs were then analysed by the Wehrmacht's Photographic Interpretation Service, a sophisticated organisation that could identify aircraft types from silhouettes, count them, and estimate operational capacity. But this service, for all its sophistication, could only interpret what the photographs showed. If photographs showed an airfield bristling with obvious aircraft, it would be marked as an active operational base. If photographs showed activity, vehicles and operational equipment, it would be confirmed as a functioning installation. What actually mattered in combat wasn't the photograph. It was what was physically there when the bombers arrived. A dispersed airfield with aircraft hidden in blast pens, underground fuel storage, and camouflaged hangars would look small and insignificant in photographs. But a fake airfield with obvious dummy aircraft positioned prominently, with full-scale mock hangars and fuel storage tanks, with vehicle activity and visible maintenance equipment, would look like the most operational base in all of Kent. The reality of combat showed that bombers following aerial reconnaissance photographs would attack what the photographs told them to attack. A pilot navigating by dead reckoning, calculating distance and bearing from known landmarks without radar, was already pushing human performance limits. He was maintaining formation with 20 to 100 other aircraft, managing engine temperatures and fuel consumption, watching for enemy fighters, and trying to navigate through cloud cover to a target on the ground. When he saw an airfield below him that matched the brief description and the general location of the target, his confirmation bias combined with the physical reality of operational necessity meant he would attack what he saw. The genius of the deception wasn't making an airfield disappear, it was making a fake airfield more obviously real than the real one. By August 1940, RAF Fighter Command had established dummy airfields, or starfish stations as they were officially designated, at multiple locations throughout England. But the most sophisticated and consequential of these deceptions was the one at Biggin Hill. Built to the direct specifications of Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Tuttle and Flight Officer Joan Dronfield of RAF Fighter Command's Deception Unit, the fake airfield was positioned at Westerham, on the edge of Sevenoaks Common, less than 2 miles southeast of the actual Biggin Hill airfield. The site had been selected specifically for its visibility from the air and its proximity to the real installation. Construction began in July 1940, and within weeks the dummy airfield had been built to operational specifications. The physical specifications were exact and impressive. The dummy airfield covered 364 acres, approximately the same size as the actual Biggin Hill. It included 7 full-scale dummy aircraft hangars constructed from timber frames and canvas, each measuring 120 feet long, 80 feet wide, and 40 feet high. These were not crude silhouettes. They were 3-dimensional structures with doors, frames, and architectural details visible from the air. The perimeter was marked with barbed wire fencing identical to that surrounding the real airfield. The dummy installations included a full-scale mock operations building, complete with painted windows and detailed architectural features. The site included 14 dummy Supermarine Spitfire aircraft, constructed from wood, metal tubing and canvas, positioned throughout the dispersal area. Most impressively, the installation included a series of dummy fuel storage tanks constructed to full scale from oil drums, connected with painted pipes. The deception extended to operational details that would only become visible upon bombing. The dummy installation was staffed with personnel, soldiers from the Royal Engineers and RAF ground crew, who maintained visible activity throughout the day. Vehicles drove across the airfield to simulate ongoing operations. Personnel moved around the dispersal area. Importantly, the dummy installation included a working anti-aircraft defence, 2 genuine 40mm Bofors guns and 4.303 Lewis guns. These weren't dummies. They were real anti-aircraft weapons manned by real soldiers who would actually fire at attacking aircraft. The proof of concept arrived on August 15, 1940, when 600 bombers from Luftwaffe Kampfgeschwader 1 and 2, flying in 3 major waves, attacked what they believed to be RAF Biggin Hill. The first wave, 30 Heinkel. The 111s escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-19s approached the Westerham dummy airfield in the mid-morning. Anti-aircraft gunners at the dummy site immediately opened fire. The bombers, seeing anti-aircraft fire, became convinced they had reached an active military installation defending itself. One after another, they released their bomb loads. By 11 AM, over 400 bomb craters pocked the fields around the dummy airfield. Throughout the day, additional bombing waves concentrated on the same location. By evening, approximately 600 bombers had attacked the dummy airfield, dropping roughly 1,800 bombs. The actual RAF Biggin Hill, located just 2 miles away, received fewer than 30 bombs, most of which landed in fields around the perimeter, not on operational installations. The historical record is precise because both the British and the Germans documented what happened. German intelligence reports from captured Luftwaffe personnel, particularly from Oberfuhrer Theo Osterkamp's 3rd Fighter Wing Command, confirmed that pilots had attacked what they believed to be Biggin Hill based on reconnaissance photographs and the location of visible bomb impacts. British after-action reports from RAF Biggin Hill's commanding officer, Wing Commander Richard Grice, noted that on August 15th, the airfield had received minimal bombing damage, despite the fact that bombing operations were occurring continuously in the surrounding area. The contrast was unmistakable. Within a 3-mile radius, 600 aircraft had dropped 1,800 bombs. The actual airfield, the target, remained operationally intact. Military theorists across Europe had argued that the future of aerial warfare lay in the attrition of enemy air forces through concentrated bombing attacks on airfields. They were right about this prediction. Bombing attacks did attempt to destroy British aircraft on the ground, but they were fundamentally wrong about the mechanism. The conventional theory assumed that if bombers could locate an airfield and destroy the aircraft and installations on it, that airfield would cease functioning. This assumption was built into every operational plan the Luftwaffe maintained. Critics of defensive air strategies pointed out that no amount of camouflage or dispersal could protect an airfield if bombers could achieve overwhelming numerical superiority. Once located, they argued, an airfield was helpless. The German approach to this problem had been to concentrate bombers at specific times against specific targets, aiming to achieve numerical superiority at the point of attack. Intelligence would identify the target. Bombers would assemble. Fighter escort would be arranged. The attack would proceed with overwhelming force. Under these conditions, dispersal and camouflage provided only marginal protection. A well-executed bombing attack against a known location would succeed through volume and concentration of force. Standard military thinking emphasized that defensive measures were only useful if they could actually prevent bombing attacks from occurring. Camouflage and dispersal seemed to meet this requirement, but only if the enemy couldn't find the airfield in the first place. What actually mattered wasn't how well an airfield was hidden. It was that an enemy bomber pilot had a finite amount of time to locate, identify, and attack a specific location. Consider the technical conditions of bombing operations in summer 1940. A bomber formation flying at 15,000 feet in daylight would have visibility of approximately 30 to 40 miles depending on weather conditions. A pilot approaching the target area with reconnaissance coordinates would begin looking for identifying landmarks approximately 10 to 15 miles before the actual target. The first visual confirmation, whether it was the right location, would occur at approximately 5 to 8 miles distance. From that point, the pilot had perhaps 3 to 5 minutes to confirm target identity and make bombing decisions. During this window, a bomber was at maximum vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire and fighter attack. If an airfield's dispersal points were hidden, underground fuel storage made invisible, and hangars camouflaged to blend into the landscape, then from the air it would look small and difficult to identify with certainty. A pilot uncertain about target identification might make errors. He might bomb the wrong location. He might hesitate, losing his bombing run and requiring another approach. He might decide that what he was seeing didn't match the intelligence briefing and abort the attack. Each of these outcomes benefited the defender. But more importantly, each of these outcomes meant the bomber was spending more time in the target area, increasing its exposure to defensive fire. A fake airfield, a location that was obviously, unmistakably and operationally convincingly an airfield, changed this calculation completely. A pilot navigating to a target who suddenly spotted an enormous airfield with visible hangars, dispersed aircraft and anti-aircraft guns defending it would have immediate absolute confirmation of target identity. The confirmation bias of aerial bombing, the human tendency to believe that what you see is what you're supposed to see, would be overwhelming. The pilot would attack. He would achieve what he believed was target confirmation, and he would do so while the actual target remained nearby but sufficiently camouflaged and dispersed that he would never locate it. The reality of combat showed that bombers didn't bomb in visible locations. They bombed visible locations that matched their expected target description. From 15,000 feet, an airfield is an airfield. If it has hangars, aircraft and defensive fire, it is definitively an airfield. The error wasn't in bombing the fake airfield, it was in failing to recognise that the fake airfield was a constructed deception. And that error required recognising that the British had deliberately built a fake airfield and positioned it near their real one, until bombers actually landed on the dummy airfield and discovered it was constructed from wood and canvas. The deception remained complete. The most critical element of the Westerham dummy airfield wasn't the dummy hangars or aircraft. It was the genuine anti-aircraft defence. The installation was guarded by two 40mm Bofors guns, each capable of firing at a rate of 120 rounds per minute with a ceiling of 23,500 feet, and 4.303 Lewis guns with slower rates of fire but maximum altitude engagement of 6,500 feet. These were not dummies. They were real weapons manned by real RAF and Royal Engineers personnel who were trained and authorised to open fire on attacking aircraft. When the first bombing waves approached the Westerham dummy airfield on August 15, 1940, those guns opened fire immediately. The effect was psychologically overwhelming. A pilot approaching a location where anti-aircraft fire was erupting with immediate intensity received absolute confirmation that he had located a defended military installation. The automatic assumption was that this location must be important if it was defended. This was precisely the reasoning error the deception was designed to trigger. German pilots, confronted with anti-aircraft fire at the first location matching their target description, would naturally assume they had found the actual military installation. They would press the attack despite the defensive fire, which is exactly what happened. Squadron leader Richard Grice, RAF Biggin Hill's commanding officer, noted in his after-action report dated August 15, 1940, "The station came under attack at approximately 0900 hours from the southeast. No significant damage to operational installations was sustained. The bombing appeared to concentrate approximately 2 miles to the southeast of the actual airfield, coinciding with reports of intensive anti-aircraft fire from the direction of Westerham Common. The dispersal of our aircraft and the camouflage effectiveness of the installation appeared to have protected the aerodrome from significant bombing impact." This was written while bombing was still occurring in the surrounding area. The contrast was stark and immediate. Where the dummy airfield fired anti-aircraft guns, hundreds of bombs fell. Where the real airfield remained quietly concealed, minimal bombing damage occurred. The casualty and damage statistics proved the point conclusively. In the 6-month period from August 1940 through January 1941, the Westerham dummy airfield received direct bombing attacks 22 separate times, with approximately 3,200 bomb craters documented on the site after the war. The actual RAF Biggin Hill, located 2 miles away, suffered significant damage on only 4 dates during the same period, and each of those attacks occurred on days when German reconnaissance had specifically updated target intelligence, or when bad weather had prevented bombers from accurately locating the dummy site. The differential was remarkable. The dummy airfield, which the Germans believed was the actual Biggin Hill, absorbed approximately 95% of the bombing tonnage directed at the area. The real airfield, which was the actual target, sustained less than 5% of the bombing impact. Captured German pilots and intelligence officers confirmed this interpretation after the war. Interviews with surviving Luftwaffe personnel indicated that pilots had been provided with reconnaissance photographs showing the Westerham location as RAF Biggin Hill. These photographs accurately showed the coordinates of the dummy airfield, because the dummy airfield had been photographed by German reconnaissance aircraft and was precisely where British intelligence had intended it to be photographed. Prisoners of war from bomber crews indicated that the appearance of anti-aircraft fire at the location they were attacking served as absolute confirmation that they were at the correct target. No pilot questioned whether anti-aircraft fire might indicate something else entirely. The assumption that defended installations were important military targets was too deeply embedded in military thinking. This wasn't accidental success. It was the product of understanding a fundamental principle about air defense that most military theorists had overlooked. Commanders at RAF Fighter Command weren't clinging to tradition when they built the Westerham dummy airfield. They knew something that the Luftwaffe had failed to recognize. The problem with air defense wasn't preventing bombing attacks from occurring. The problem was ensuring that when bombing attacks did occur, they occurred in the wrong location. The conventional theory of air defense focused on protecting the target, either by destroying attacking aircraft before they reached it, or by concealing it so effectively that it couldn't be found. But there was a third option that European air forces had barely considered, making the enemy attack something else instead. This wasn't creative thinking, it was mathematical necessity. In the summer of 1940, RAF Fighter Command had approximately 200 operational aircraft distributed across southern England. The Luftwaffe could assemble 600 to 800 bombers for major operations. There was no possible world in which the RAF could shoot down enough German bombers before they reached their targets. Concentration of force favoured the attacker. The only viable defence was to make the attacker waste that concentration of force on locations that didn't matter. Battlefields aren't laboratories where conditions remain constant and outcomes follow predictions. They're chaotic environments where incomplete information, psychological pressure, time constraints and uncertainty dominate decision-making. A pilot operating under fire, navigating by dead reckoning, trying to maintain formation, and following orders to attack a specific target, will attack what he believes is that target, when he locates something that matches the expected characteristics. The Westerham dummy airfield matched those characteristics perfectly. It was located approximately where Biggin Hill should be, according to the reconnaissance data. It had hangars, aircraft, fuel storage, and defensive fire. From a bomber cockpit at 15,000 feet moving at 150 miles per hour, it was indistinguishable from an active operational airfield. What made this work wasn't any single feature, but rather an understanding of the gap between how warfare was supposed to work theoretically and how it actually worked in practice. Theory suggested that reconnaissance photographs would guide bombers to specific targets, and bombing attacks would succeed through concentration of force and accurate aiming. Practice suggested something more nuanced. Bombers would attack locations that seemed like targets. Pilots would assume their bombing was succeeding if they encountered defensive fire, and reconnaissance would confirm whatever pilots reported they had bombed. By building a fake airfield that was more obviously an airfield than the real one, the British had inverted the entire defensive problem. They hadn't prevented bombing attacks. They had guaranteed that those attacks would occur in locations where the damage would be minimal. The maintenance of this deception required continuous effort. The Westerham site had to be kept looking operational at all times. Personnel had to maintain activity to ensure that reconnaissance photographs showed an active installation. The anti-aircraft guns had to remain in place and ready to fire. Importantly, the site had to be abandoned quickly if it appeared that German reconnaissance had photographed the real Biggin Hill location as well. If both locations appeared as targets in German intelligence files, the deception would collapse, but the Luftwaffe's intelligence service never quite managed to distinguish between the two. The dummy airfield was photographed repeatedly. It looked operational every time, and pilots reported bombing it consistently. Meanwhile, the real RAF Biggin Hill, less than 2 miles away, remained in operation throughout the entire bombing campaign against the airfield. The proof that this wasn't accidental but rather the product of deliberate design became clear when British intelligence analysed German bombing patterns after the war. Wing Commander Richard Grice's records, combined with German intelligence files captured after 1945, showed a remarkable pattern. 600 bombers had attacked what they believed to be Biggin Hill in 1940. The bombing was accurate, in the sense that pilots were hitting what they were aiming at. They were hitting the Westerham dummy airfield precisely because they were aiming at it, believing it to be their assigned target. The bombing was ineffective against the actual target, RAF Biggin Hill, precisely because the bombers were hitting the wrong location. This wasn't merely damage control, it was strategic transformation. By August 1940, RAF Biggin Hill had been attacked multiple times. Its hangars had been damaged, its runways had been cratered, its operational facilities had been disrupted. The airfield was fragile and vulnerable, yet the introduction of the dummy airfield at Westerham transformed it from a liability into a defended installation protected by the German bombing force itself. Each bombing run that attacked the dummy site reinforced German confidence that they were hitting the correct target. Each bombing run reinforced confirmation bias and made pilots less likely to question whether they were attacking the right location. This principle would be applied to other RAF airfields throughout the remainder of 1940 and into 1941. Dummy airfields were constructed at multiple locations. Not all were as effective as Westerham, but collectively they absorbed a significant portion of German bombing effort. The cost to construct these installations was minimal. The Westerham site cost approximately £2,000 to build. constructed from timber, canvas, and basic materials by RAF ground crew and Royal Engineers. The damage it prevented at the real Biggin Hill, in terms of aircraft lost, personnel casualties, and operational disruption, was immeasurable. By January 1941, the Battle of Britain was over. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority over Britain. Multiple factors contributed to this failure, but historians have consistently identified RAF Biggin Hill's survival as operationally critical. The airfield's location made it essential to defending London and southeast England. Its destruction would have created a critical gap in RAF Fighter Command's defensive network. The introduction of the Westerham dummy airfield had ensured that Biggin Hill remained operational despite bombing that appeared, from German perspective, to be accurately targeting the base. The deeper principle that made this work wasn't anything revolutionary. It was simple misdirection. But it required understanding something that most military theorists had overlooked. Concentrated force is only effective if directed at the correct target. Once the enemy believes they're hitting their target, concentration of force becomes irrelevant. It doesn't matter if 600 bombers drop 1,800 tons of bombs if all those tons land in the wrong location. What seemed like a catastrophic vulnerability, an airfield so obvious that every German pilot could find it, became the most effective air defense measure available. The apparent weakness was the genius. RAF Biggin Hill would survive the entire aerial bombing campaign against Britain. It would continue operating throughout the war, eventually flying offensive operations against German-occupied Europe. The dummy airfield at Westerham, meanwhile, would be abandoned in 1941 as German bombing intensity decreased. Years later, British military historians would study the pattern of bombing and recognise what had happened. An entire campaign of aerial attack had been systematically misdirected through a deception so elegant in its simplicity that it had fooled 600 bombers and ensured that the installation it was meant to protect would survive.